As England stepped into the 14th century, a boy of only 14 took the throne, Edward III. The reign of this young king would not only reshape his kingdom, but change the fate of the continent. In 1327, following the deposition of his father Edward II, Edward III was proclaimed king while still a child. In the early years of his reign, power remained in the hands of his mother Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer. But within just a few years, the young king proved his competence. In 1330, he had Mortimer arrested in a night raid and took control of power himself. Edward's reign was not merely the rule of a king, but the formation of a new era. To glorify his dynasty, he set his sights not only on England, but also on the throne of France. Through his mother's Capetian bloodline, he found a legal foundation to claim the crown of France. This claim launched the Hundred Years' War in 1337. England was no longer merely an island kingdom. It now stood at the centre of the European balance of power. Edward sanctified his victories on the battlefield with the culture of chivalry. The Order of the Garter, founded in 1348, became not only a symbol of loyalty, but also of knightly spirit dedicated to the English crown. In many ways, it was the Arthurian legend made flesh. By including Parliament in governance, he maintained a balance in his relations with the nobility. As Weir emphasises, Edward was not only a commanding king, but a consultative one. Parliament became a co-decision maker with the king in matters such as taxation and foreign policy. This marked a turning point in the constitutional development of England. Under Edward's rule, the monarchy began to function not merely as a royal institution, but as a socio-political network. The king expanded the foundation of public legitimacy by listening not only to lords, but also to merchants and town councils. In all these respects, the reign of Edward III was not merely a period of growth for England, it was a time when England became England. But the foundation of this grandeur rested on something far more fragile, the complexity of dynastic succession, and that complexity would give birth to civil war within a generation. In 1337, King Edward III of England made a decision that would alter the course of history. He claimed the French throne. His justification was his Capetian lineage through his mother Isabella, but the real issue lay elsewhere. According to the traditional succession laws of France under Salic law, inheritance could not pass through the female line. Still, Edward saw France's political weakness as an opportunity. Initially, his goal was to defend English-held territories, such as Gascony and Calais. But soon his ambitions grew. Now he wanted the French crown itself. England was prepared for war both politically and socially. Edward, as chroniclers later noted, was as much a master of propaganda as of warfare. Once he declared his claim, a chivalric mobilization spread throughout the kingdom. In 1340, he openly proclaimed himself King of France, and the English royal arms were redesigned to include not just the three lions, but also the French fleur-de-lis. In 1346, the English army landed in northern France. The objective, Crécy. In this battle, the longbowmen were the English army's greatest asset. It was not a war of noble knights, but of peasant archers. The English, vastly outnumbered, crushed the French. The longbows cut down the French cavalry. 10 years later, in 1356, a similar scene unfolded at Poitiers. This time, the French king Jean II himself was captured. Edward's son, the Black Prince, stepped onto the historical stage. His military skill marked him as the next star of the English royal line. This war was not merely a fight over a crown, it was the revival of old Plantagenet claims. The territories England held in France were also of crucial economic importance. Through the port of Calais, England's wool trade flowed into the heart of Europe. But the war opened not only foreign fronts, but domestic ones as well. In its early phase, England experienced economic growth. War spoils and expanding trade enriched the nobility and strengthened certain merchant cities. But the cost was steep, the constant increase in tax demands, growing social pressure on peasants, labour shortages, and agricultural decline. The burden of war was not shared equally. Edward was strong, but his kingdom was fragile. A chasm grew between the enriched aristocracy and the oppressed peasantry. And after every victory, more was needed: more money, more soldiers, more suffering. The victories at Crécy and Poitiers legitimized England's claim to France. But they also gave birth to a new England. The transition from chivalric to professional armies, the empowerment of nobles through warfare, and the slow shift of the economy toward urbanization became inevitable. By the mid-14th century, the prolific family tree of Edward III revealed not strength, but vulnerability. Each of his sons, rewarded with their own county or duchy, began to build their own political centres. This created a new problem for England: one crown, too many power centres. Two major branches emerged from the sons of Edward during this period. John of Gaunt, Edward's third son, his descendants would form the House of Lancaster. His son, Henry Bolingbroke, later Henry IV, would stand at the centre of a crisis of legitimacy. Edmund of Langley, the fifth son, his descendants would establish the House of York. His grandson Richard would later become the Yorkist claimant at the heart of the Wars of the Roses. Lineage was tangled, claims to the throne were complex, and inheritances were deeply entangled. In this system, it was not only the king who could be called an heir, many could claim the same right. In medieval England, the political system rested on a feudal balance in which the central authority relied on the power of the nobility. The king could not rule the country directly. Instead, he granted land, titles, and autonomy to dukes and earls who were expected to be loyal. Over time, however, these nobles, especially great houses like Lancaster, York, and Warwick, came to possess their own armies, revenues, and networks of allegiance. Edward's system had, in effect, imperialized the nobility. In the north and west, powerful duchies began to resemble independent principalities. Edward believed that by giving his sons territories and honours, he was strengthening the realm. But in truth, every title he granted planted the seed of a future claim. This was a classic medieval problem. The more sons you have, the less loyalty you retain. The crown belongs to one person, but the dynasty is always crowded. And if that crowd thirsts for war, the kingdom is reduced to nothing more than a battlefield, and its noble lineages become the roots that bleed. Edward III's legacy was marked not only by war, but by the dynasty he left behind. 5 of his sons reached adulthood, and each one represented not only the prestige of the house, but the seeds of its collapse. Now let us meet his sons. The eldest son, Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince. He was the people's favourite. Known as the Black Prince, not just for his dark armour, but for the shadow he cast over his enemies at Poitiers and Crécy. His skill in war evoked the golden age of chivalry. He was both his father's pride and the hero of the people, but he would never become king. In 1376, while his father was still alive, he died. He left behind a small child, Richard. That child would one day ascend the throne, but he would never emerge from the shadow of his grandfather or his father. Richard II inherited not his father's warrior spirit, but his loneliness. The third son, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. He was the third son, but his power was second to none. John of Gaunt became the de facto ruler of the realm as his father aged. He was the very image of aristocratic authority, a baron woven from land, wealth, and strategic marriage alliances. His estate stretched from Yorkshire to Gascony. He was the greatest lord in England. But his true strength lay in his son, Henry Bolingbroke. That son would one day defy Richard II, face exile, and return to take the crown. Henry IV would become the first king of the Lancastrian dynasty. The fifth son, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York. He was Edward's fifth son. He was neither as warlike as the Black Prince nor as politically powerful as John of Gaunt, but his name would one day become the origin of a lineage that would bathe England in blood. In 1385, Edmund was granted the title of Duke of York. His house would carry not a martial legacy, but a historical claim. One of his sons, Richard, Duke of York, would go so far as to declare himself king. The Yorkist line would not base its claim on power, but on the right of ancestry. This dynastic claim would become not only a matter of blood, but a challenge to the very structure of constitutional authority. The youngest son, Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester. He was the last, but perhaps the most dangerous. Thomas of Woodstock, the youngest brother, became one of the fiercest opponents of Richard II's rule. He helped form a group in Parliament known as the Lords Appellant, who launched formal investigations against the king's favourites. But power does not remain loyal for long. In 1397, under Richard's orders, Thomas was arrested. Soon after, without even a formal trial, he was killed. It was a preview of the civil war to come. Edward III had granted his sons titles. Each received a castle, raised an army, built their own sphere of influence. But the throne belonged to only one, and as the claimants multiplied, loyalty diminished. In 1376, Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, succumbed to an illness that had plagued him for years. Invincible in battle, he died weakened in bed. His father, Edward III, was still alive. The other sons were powerful, but they could not take the place of the eldest. Edward's son Richard was only 9 years old. In the English monarchy, the system of succession was based on primogeniture, the right of the eldest son and then his sons. But the problem was this: would the people accept a child king, or did they want a strong adult? Prince Richard was legally the heir, but the realm was forced to bear the weight of a boy. This showed that succession was not only a matter of legitimacy, but also of practicality. Then a new figure stepped into the scene: Richard's uncle, John of Gaunt, Edward's most powerful surviving son, Duke of Lancaster. He was not king in name, but in effect he ruled the country. John of Gaunt held direct influence over taxation, foreign affairs, and court appointments. This situation sparked resentment both at court and among the people. It was during this period that England began for the first time to question whether the crown was a personal possession or a public trust. At this point, Edward III was old and ineffective. Richard was young and unprepared. And meanwhile, the nobles were gathering power. When Richard II came to the throne in 1377, after the death of his grandfather, he was only 10 years old. The crown had passed to him, but government, of course, did not. England at the time was governed by the House of Lords and the King's Circle of Advisers. But this was not a simple regency. It was a far more complicated balance. It was the first period in which the boundaries of constitutional monarchy were truly tested. There was a king, but he did not rule. There was a parliament, but it did not govern. There were advisers, but they were at war with one another. This power vacuum was felt not only in court, but also in the streets. In the summer of 1381, a revolt shook England, the Peasants' Revolt. Taxes had risen sharply, the agricultural system had collapsed after the plague, and for the first time the people marched directly toward their king. Led by Wat Tyler, thousands of rebels entered London. The young King Richard was only 14 years old, yet he faced the crowd with astonishing composure. With his words, he dispersed the masses, but Wat Tyler was suddenly killed. As Richard grew, he began to take power into his own hands. But the advisers he surrounded himself with, especially Robert de Vere and Michael de la Pole, caused great unrest among the nobility. These figures were not only the king's friends, they held direct influence over the affairs of state, and this began to test the limits of the English aristocracy. This was no longer government through institutions, but through personal ties within the royal household. The aristocracy was pushed aside, Parliament lost its authority, and governance lost transparency. And revolt came not only from the people, but from within the nobility. In 1387, 5 major nobles came together and called themselves the Lords Appellant. Their aim was to remove the king's favourites from power and even bring some to trial. All of Richard's favourites were neutralised. Richard never forgot these events. In 1397, he regained absolute power. His first move was to take revenge on the members of the Lords Appellant who had once opposed him. Thomas, Duke of Gloucester, his own uncle, was arrested and killed. Figures like Arundel and Warwick were tried, executed, or exiled. Richard was no longer a child, but he was no longer a king either. He had become the executor of his own justice. Government no longer operated through Parliament, but through the loyalty of the court. This new order signalled the rise of an absolutist model. Richard II grew up on the throne, but as he grew, he became more and more isolated. He found no lasting support from the people, the nobles, or even his own family. He personalised his rule, and in the end he was punished personally. In 1398, John of Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, was exiled by King Richard II. But the following year, after his father's death, Henry's inheritance, the vast Lancaster estates, was confiscated. This was not only the theft of a nobleman's wealth, but of his honour. But, at that point, Richard had not just disobeyed custom, he had broken legal boundaries. The balance of aristocratic loyalty, upon which the English monarchy rested, was shattered. Henry returned, not just to reclaim his lands, but to take the throne. He arrived, he spoke, he gathered power, and he became king. Henry quickly won the support of both the people and the nobility. This support was not driven only by resentment, but also by hope, the hope of relief from Richard's oppressive rule. Henry was seen as the noble prince who would restore peace. Richard II was deposed without a major battle, and he was removed from the throne by Act of Parliament. His successor was not his son, but his cousin, a new branch of the royal house. For the first time in English history, a king had been deposed outside the legal framework of succession, and the one who took his place tried to justify his rule through force of circumstance. The principle of primogeniture, that the crown should pass to the eldest son or his heir, had collapsed. The throne was no longer a right, but something that could be seized. Henry was the first to depose a king and claim the crown for himself. But what mattered more was that those who came after him would see such an act as legitimate. This event changed the nature of power in England. A king no longer ruled solely by divine right. If he was weak in the eyes of the people, he could be removed. The crown was no longer a certainty, it had become a contested prize.